Welcome to another infographic instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we will be looking at using data mining to identify roughly $2.2 billion in shadow banking revenue. As you will recall during this infographic series, we've been talking about shadow banking as serving as a substitute or a complement to traditional banking. And we've noted that depending on the country, shadow banking has complemented traditional banking by giving extra resources where needed. And in other countries, shadow banking has replaced or it has substituted for formal banking, which is often too highly regulated and unresponsive to these emerging markets' needs. Now, let's turn our attention to these 7 areas where shadow bankers can potentially earn revenues. The first indicator looks at payables stress, and this basically looks at accounts payable to total liabilities. And we know that as companies depend very heavily on accounts payable, which are short-term debts given often to commercial partners, if they can replace this debt with longer-term debt or even quasi-equity relationships, such as those often found in securitization, then in theory this will make business more profitable and more stable. Now we've identified, just for the sake of illustration, 8 companies that have extremely high accounts payable to total liabilities ratios. We see companies from China, namely Suning Commerce Group, we see Renert, we see Blue Label, and so forth. You can read the description for yourself. We show the name of the company, we show the country that the company is from, and we show the assets, rather outdated valuation of assets of those companies at the time we did our analysis. And according to this analysis, if shadow bankers are able to replace a part of this accounts payable finance, they will earn $108 million only for this group of countries that have extremely high accounts payable to total liabilities ratios. The second measure looks at collection stress, and this looks at receivables to revenues. And again, you can see the list of companies for yourself, the top 2 actually coming from Latin America, from Brazil and from Chile. And shadow bankers can earn roughly $510 million if they focus on these companies with extremely high receivables to revenue ratios. The third measure looks at quick interest stress. And this basically measures interest payments relative to current liabilities. So this looks at the extent to which companies are having to pay out a fair amount of cash in interest payments rather than use other forms of finance. And again, we see Latin American companies basically in the top 5 of this list, from Mexico, Brazil, and mostly Brazil, and we see that potential shadow bankers can earn roughly $471 million in revenues if they focus on these companies. The next measure looks at debt loads, and this measures debt to total liabilities, and unlike in the previous cases, we see a mix of companies from various geographical locations. China with China National Building Materials, Brazil CIA Mining, and South Africa Mobile Telecommunications Company. And the estimated revenues for potential shadow bankers are $265 million. Next measure looks at cash out risk, and that is a measure of cash to current liabilities. So this assesses the extent to which companies could potentially run out of cash for regular working capital needs. And we see that, again, this is a mixed group of companies from Singapore, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa. And the estimated revenues for this group of countries are $153 million. The next indicator looks at short interest stress, which measures interest to accounts payable. And again, we see that this group of countries is a mix, focusing partly on China, such as China Longyuan Power Group, and also looking at China Yangtze Power. But the other countries are from a broad geographical disbursement of locations. And we see that the estimated revenues for shadow bankers focusing on these ratios would be 568 million, approximately. And the final measure looks at receivable stress, which is the ratio of accounts receivable to accounts payable. And naturally, this looks at the extent to which companies can use the money they're getting in accounts receivable in order to pay off accounts payable, and to think about how shadow bankers can insert themselves into this cycle of basically accounts payable replenishment. And again, we see, well, Singapore actually holding the dominant positions on our list, Indo-Food Agri-Resources, and the others that you can see in the infographic. And shadow bankers focusing on this indicator can earn 106 million in revenue. So I think the moral of this infographic is that shadow banking can provide substitutes for traditional short-term finance, which makes these companies more fragile and probably increases the cost of their capital. This is Brian Michael with another Infographic Instant.